Hello, my friend. Welcome to the long quiet. Tonight you are a Vermont station master keeping the lamps lit on the final night of your small depot before the line closes forever. In autumn 1912, by a little after 4 o'clock on a late October evening in the year 1912, in the small valley of the Upper White River in central Vermont, an old man named Henry Whitcomb was walking down the wagon road from his small white house toward the depot at Wilder's Crossing, where he had been the station master for 31 years, and where he would tonight work his last evening shift. The road was packed dirt, hard now with the early frosts of the season, and Whitcomb's boots made the small flat sound on it that they always made. The road ran a half-mile from his door to the depot, due east, with hayfields gone brown for the autumn on both sides and a low stand of sugar maples along the southern fence line, their last leaves a deep red-orange in the slant of the late afternoon light. From the small rise of his front porch, a man could see the slate roof of the depot and the small water tower beyond it, and beyond those the long line of the cut, where the branch line ran south through the woods toward Bethel and the junction with the main line of the Central Vermont Railway. He buttoned his coat. The coat was the long blue railroad coat the line had issued him in 1881. The brass buttons had been polished by his thumb so many times that the small embossed letters of the railroad's name were nearly worn smooth. The wool had thinned a little at the elbows and cuffs. He had not had it replaced. The coat had become, over 31 years, a small particular thing of his own, and he wore it tonight as he had worn it 10,000 other evenings. He walked. The air had that late October smell of wet leaves and wood smoke and old hay. A small thin smoke rose, far off, from the chimney of the Pratchett farm on the rise to the north, where Owen Pratchett was banking his stove for the night. Another, fainter, from the small farmhouse of the widow Hammond, a mile down the valley to the south. The smokes rose slow and straight in the still evening air, and stood as small gray columns against the slowly darkening sky before drifting, very gentle, eastward over the woods. There was no wind. There was almost no sound. There was only the small flat sound of his boots on the road, and far off, the small high cry of a crow somewhere over the hayfield. He came at last in sight of the depot. The depot at Wilder's Crossing was a small wood frame building of perhaps 30 feet by 20, painted the dark green and cream of the Central Vermont line, with a slate roof and a single brick chimney, and a small platform of weathered planks running the length of the trackside. It had been built in 1878, 8 years before he had come to it. The water tower stood a little way down the line, 50 yards perhaps, on its 4 long iron legs, with the long swinging spout that the firemen of the line had been pulling down to water their tenders for 34 years. There was a small freight shed beyond the tower, and beyond the freight shed the long iron of the rails going off into the woods toward Bethel. The depot was quiet. The depot was always quiet at this hour. It had been quiet at this hour for 31 years, and quieter still in recent years, as the freight had grown less, as the passenger trains had been reduced first to 3 a day, then to 2, then to the 1 a day that ran now. The railway had announced the closure of the line in the spring, and they had set the date of the final run for the end of October, and the date had come. Tomorrow the depot would be locked and dark, and number 9 would not run, and no train would ever again come up the small cut from Bethel to the small clearing in the woods, where he had spent the working life of a man. He thought of this without grief. He had been thinking of it for many months, and he had come to the small settled understanding men come to who have done a kind of work for a long time and have known the work was ending. The line had had its life. The depot had had its life. The trains had had their life. He had had his. There was no use being sad about a thing that had run its full course. He reached the platform. He stepped up onto the planks. The planks were weathered gray and warped a little here and there, and one of them, the third from the south end, had been loose for 2 years, and would, he knew, never be tightened now. The loose plank made its small, soft knock under his boot, as it always did. He came to the door. He took the key from the ring on his belt. The key was a long brass key, worn smooth and gold by the 31 years of being turned in the same lock. He set it in the lock, He turned it. The lock made the small dry click it always made. He pushed the door open. The door scraped, very gentle on the small low ridge where the floor of the depot had settled in the years he had been there. And the small dry warmth of the closed depot came out to meet him. He stepped in. The depot was a single room of plain plank construction, with a small ticket window on the east wall, a long wooden bench along the inside of the south wall, a small cast iron stove in the southwest corner, the small telegraph table against the west wall under its high window, and the schedule chalkboard mounted above the bench. There were 3 kerosene lamps on iron brackets on the walls, one above the stove, one above the bench, one above the telegraph table. There was a small hand-tinted map of the Central Vermont system on the north wall, framed in dark oak. There was the small clock above the ticket window, a Seth Thomas of about 1885, ticking still in the quiet. He looked around the room. He looked at it the way a man looks at a room he has stood in 10,000 times. He did not feel anything in particular. He felt only the small, quiet recognition that all the small, particular things of the room were still where they had been the last 10,000 times he had stood here. He went to the stove. The stove was cold. He had banked it on Sunday and had not been in since. The small gray bed of ash lay quiet behind the small iron door. He opened the door. He raked the ash. He laid a small, careful fire of birch and maple. In the small, slow way he had laid every fire in this stove for 31 years. He struck a match. He held it to the kindling. The kindling took. The flame stood up small and clean and yellow. He shut the door, but not the damper. He waited a moment, listening, the way a man listens to a new fire to be sure of it. The fire took hold. He could hear in the small, dry quiet of the depot the small, soft hiss of the draft pulling through the firebox. He closed the damper a quarter. He went to the telegraph table. The telegraph table was a small plain table of dark oak with a single drawer and a small leather pad, and the small brass key and sounder set of the railroad. The sounder was a Western Union model of about 1878, brass and iron, with the small magnetic core in its black wooden box. He sat down in the wooden chair. He listened for a moment in the small, expectant way of a telegraph man. There was no traffic. There would perhaps be no traffic at all tonight. Tomorrow there would be no Wilders crossing on the wire. And the operators at Bethel and South Royalton would not be sending up any messages. And the small click-clack of the brass sounder, which had clicked and clacked through his 31 years, would, after tonight, simply stop. The sound had been the small, steady voice of the wide working world, calling down the wire to the small clearing in the woods. And he had answered it 10,000 times in his small, careful hand. He set his hand on the key. He did not send anything. He only set his hand on the brass. In the unconscious way a man sets a hand on a familiar thing. And he felt the small, cool round of the knob under his thumb. The key was warm where his thumb rested. The key had been warm under his thumb 10,000 evenings. He lifted his hand. He went to the schedule chalkboard. The schedule chalkboard was a slate board in a dark oak frame above the long bench. On it, in his own small, careful hand, were chalked the times of the day's trains. There had been more trains once. There had been 5, then 4, then 3, then 2. Now the list held only one entry. He read it in the thinning light of the late afternoon. Number 9. Down. 7:40 p.m. That was the entire schedule of his last evening at Wilder's Crossing. He went to the first of the kerosene lamps. The lamp above the bench was a tall brass lamp with a smoked glass chimney set in its iron bracket on the wall. He took it down. He filled it from the small can of kerosene in the cupboard. He set it back in its bracket. He struck a match. He held it to the wick. The wick took with the small, soft pop of a properly trimmed wick taking. The flame stood up small and yellow and steady. He pulled the chimney down. He adjusted the burner. The flame settled into the long, slow yellow of a properly burning kerosene lamp. He did the same with the lamp above the stove. He did the same with the lamp above the telegraph table. When all 3 were lit, he stood for a moment in the middle of the room, looking at them. The depot had 3 small circles of warm yellow light now, and the air in the room had that small particular warmth that a small room takes on when its lamps have just been lit. the small first warmth of the evening. The warmth that says that the small, careful work of holding the night against the dark has begun. He had lit these 3 lamps 10,000 evenings. He had lit them in May and in August, and in the deep heart of January, when the snow stood 5 feet against the north wall of the depot. He had lit them on the night his wife had died. 6 years ago this November. He had lit them last night. He had lit them tonight. He would not light them tomorrow. He took the small thought and set it down. He had stopped giving it special weight. The work was the work. The work was the lighting of the lamps. He had done it tonight. The lamps were lit. That was enough. He took down the broom from its peg by the door. The broom was an old corn broom of split wood and pale yellow straw, bound with red wire. The straws had worn down a little, and the working edge had become slightly curved in the way the working edge of any well-used broom becomes curved over the long course of its sweeping. He set the broom over his shoulder and he stepped out onto the platform. The light outside had thinned. The valley had entered the long blue half-hour of late October dusk, when the world becomes a slow, even blue, and the trees on the western ridge stand black against the still bright sky. There was a low band of soft pink above the western ridge, the last of the day, and above that the long deepening blue of the sky going toward night. And high up, faint, perhaps 3 or 4 early stars. The water tower stood black against the western sky. The rails going south into the cut were 2 parallel lines of dim silver against the dark of the cinder ballast. He stepped to the south end of the platform. He turned. He set the broom to the planks. He began, in the small, steady way he had begun every sweep of this platform for 31 years, to sweep. He swept slow. The platform was perhaps 60 feet long. He had made this pass 10,000 times. He had made it in summer when the planks were dry. He had made it in winter when the planks were a small, low layer of packed snow. He had made it on the quiet evenings of October, like this one, when there was nothing to sweep but a small scatter of fallen leaves, and the small, fine grit of cinders drifted in from the ballast. He swept the leaves first. There were perhaps 24 of them, the dry brown leaves of the late October maple. with their 5 points curling inward in the way that maple leaves curl when they have lain in the open a day or two. He pushed them, slow in a small, steady ridge, toward the north end of the platform. The broom made its small, soft sound against the planks. The leaves went where he pushed them. He thought as he swept of nothing in particular. He thought perhaps of his wife Mary, who had liked the sound of his broom on the platform. She had stood on the platform with him on summer evening in the early years of their marriage. And she had said once, in her quiet way, that she liked the small sound the broom made because it was the small sound of a man taking care of a place. He had not forgotten that. He heard her voice say it tonight as he swept. He reached the north end of the planks. He turned the small ridge of leaves over the edge into the strip of grass that ran between the platform and the freight shed. The leaves fell slow and dry into the grass. He turned the broom around in his hands. He started back south. The cinders next. The cinders were a small, fine grid of black. The small wind-blown remains of the coal that had been burned in many thousands of locomotives at this small water tower. And they had drifted up onto the planks in their small, slow way over a long course of years. He swept them now. The broom moved them. They went in a small, dry, steady whisper toward the south end of the platform. He pushed them off the edge into the cinder ballast where they had come from. He made another pass north and another back south. And each time the broom found a little less, until at last he was simply walking the long 60 feet of the platform with the broom set against the planks. And there was nothing under it but the planks themselves. And the broom was only saying in its small, soft sound that the platform was clean. He came at last to the north end again. He set the broom against the wall by the door. He stood for a moment looking down the platform. The planks were clean. They had been clean 10,000 evenings. He nodded, very small to himself. He took the broom back inside the depot. He set it on its peg. He sat down at the telegraph table. He looked at the small wooden cabinet against the wall behind the telegraph table. The cabinet was a small, dark oak cabinet of 3 drawers. in which the logbooks of the Wilders Crossing Depot had been kept in order for 34 years. There were 12 volumes. The first had been begun by a man named Edwin Pickett in 1878, 4 years before Whitcomb had come to the depot. The second through the 12th had been kept in Whitcomb's own small, careful hand. He opened the cabinet. He took down the first volume. The book was a tall ledger of dark green cloth, with the brass plate on the cover stamped CV, Wilders Crossing, Valdmarcy, 1878. He set the book on the table. He opened it carefully. The paper was a heavy, cream-colored ledger paper, slightly yellowed at the edges. The first page had been written in the small, fine hand of Edwin Pickett. The date was September 14th, 1878. The entry read, "Depot opened this day. Lamps lit at 6:40 p.m. Down train. Number 2 past 7:18. Weather fine. Cool." Whitcomb smiled. Very small. He had never met Edwin Pickett. Pickett had retired in 1882. The same year Whitcomb had come up from the line at Bellows Falls. Whitcomb had come to know the man through the entries. In the small, slow way a man comes to know another man, through the small marks of his hand on paper. Pickett had been a man of small, careful sentences, a man with a steady eye on the weather, and a particular interest in the names of the freight consignee, the small farmers and small mill owners who had once made the small, busy life of this stretch of the valley. He turned the pages, slow. He read, here and there, an entry. He read Pickett's note for November the 3rd, 1879, which read, "First snow this evening. Lamps lit at 5:12. Number 2 delayed 30 minutes by drift south of the cut." He read Pickett's note for July the 11th, 1880. Hot day. Owen Pratchett's father in to ship 2 crates of butter on the morning express. He set the first volume aside. He took down the second volume. The second volume began on the 1st of April, 1882, which was the day he himself had first opened the depot at Wilders Crossing. His own small, careful hand began on the first page, in a small, thin pencil. because the ink that morning had frozen on the table. The entry read, Whitcomb, H. Assumed duty this day as stationmaster. Lamps lit at 6:50 p.m. Down train number 2 past 7:20. Weather cold. Clear. He had been 33 years old then. He had been a husband then for 3 years. He and Mary had moved from Bellows Falls in the late winter, and they had settled in the small white house up the road that the railroad had rented for them at $6 a month. And Mary had set about the small, slow business of making the house theirs. He turned forward. He read his entry for the night of October the 7th, 1885. First child born this morning. A son. William. Wife and child well. Lamps lit on time. William had grown up to be a strong, careful boy who had worked summers in the freight shed. He had gone west in 1905 to work as a brakeman on the Northern Pacific in Montana, where he still was. His letters home were short and careful, in the small way of a man who has been raised by a small, careful man. He turned forward. He read his entry for January the 18th, 1893. Daughter Margaret born this morning. Mother well. Heavy snow. Lamps lit at 4:50 p.m. Margaret had married a Burlington schoolteacher named Theodore Hale this past June. He had walked her down the aisle of the small white church in South Royalton in his only black suit, and he had given her over to Theodore Hale. And he had then come home and sat for a long while on the porch with his pipe, and had thought about the smallness of the things that mark the long course of a life. He turned forward. He read his entry for May the 11th, 1901. Wife unwell with the spring cold. Number 2 on time. Mary had recovered from that cold. She had not recovered from the second cold of 1906, which had taken her in November, when the leaves were down and the first snow was small on the hayfield. And he had walked home from the depot one evening to find her in the small bedroom and had known, from the way her breathing was, what was coming. He turned forward only a few pages. He read his entry for November the 9th, 1906. Mary Whitcomb, wife, died this morning at 9:18. Lamps lit this evening at 4:40 p.m. Number 2 on time. He set his hand on the page. He sat for a long, quiet moment with his hand on the page. He didn't weep. He had wept already. 6 years ago. In the small ways an older man weeps. And the weeping had run its course. And the long quiet of grief that comes after weeping had set in. And he had carried that quiet now for 6 years. And would carry it for whatever years remained to him. He gave the entry the small unspoken acknowledgement he gave it whenever he came across it in the volumes. Then he turned the page. He read forward. Slow. He read his entry for August the 3rd, 1896. Train delayed by deer on the line south of Bethel. Lamps lit on time. He read his entry for October the 11th, 1899. Mary brought down a small basket of apples for the engineer. Engineer Greaves expressed his thanks. He read his entry for July the 4th, 1901. Independence Day. Small bonfire on the rise north of the depot. Pratchett's children. He smiled. Very small at that one. He remembered Mary standing on the platform with him in the warm July dark, watching the small distant flicker of the bonfire on the rise. He closed the volumes. He set them back in the cabinet. He closed the cabinet door. He sat at the telegraph table for a long, quiet moment. The clock above the ticket window read 6:55. He had perhaps 45 minutes before number 9. He sat, and he looked at the small map of the Central Vermont system framed in dark oak on the north wall, with the long lines running north to Burlington and south to White River Junction and east to St. Johnsbury, and the small short branch line that ran up the small valley of the upper White River to the small green dot labeled in small old type, Wilder's Crossing. He looked at his own small, careful hand on the schedule chalkboard. He looked at the small black telegraph sounder. He sat for a while in that small, steady looking, in the way a man looks at the small particulars of a place he has loved for a long time, without ever having quite known that he loved it. He had not put it to himself as love. He had put it to himself perhaps as duty, or as habit, or as work. The word love would not have come to him about it. But he understood in the small, quiet way an older man understands the small, quiet truths of his own working life. That the small green and cream depot at Wilder's Crossing had been a kind of love too. He sat with the understanding. He did not name it. Far off, very far, perhaps 3 miles down the cut, the first whistle of number 9 came up the valley. He heard it before he was certain he had heard it. The whistle was a long, low, sustained note, very faint, blowing for the small crossing at Stinson's. It came up through the still October air, the way such a sound comes a long way through deep water, slow and gentle, and it touched him in the chest the way it had touched him 10,000 other evenings. He stood. He took his coat from the peg by the door. He put it on. He buttoned it. He took the small lantern from its bracket beside the door. He checked the wick. He struck a match. The lantern took. He set the chimney down. The flame settled. He opened the door. He stepped out onto the platform. The platform was full dark now. The blue half hour had passed. The sky above the valley was a deep, clear black, with the stars coming in fast and bright the way they come on a late October, the Vermont evening when there is no moon and no cloud. He could see the long band of the Milky Way, reaching from the southern ridge over to the northern ridge. He could see Cassiopeia high in the east. He could see low in the west the small bright point of Venus, which had been the evening star all month. He set the lantern on the bench. He stood at the south end of the platform, looking down the rails into the dark. The whistle came again. Closer. It was perhaps 2 miles now. He could hear, behind the whistle, the slow, heavy chuff of the locomotive working its way north, along the long grade out of the lower valley. Number 9 would be in sight in 8 or 9 minutes. He stood. He watched the dark. The dark was a deep, clean dark of late October Vermont, the kind that smells of hayfields and wood smoke, and the first sharpness of frost. He breathed it. He let it settle in his chest. He had stood on this platform watching for the evening train 10,000 times. He had stood here in the heavy snow of January, when the snow had come down so thick that he could not see the rails 10 feet beyond the platform's edge, and the headlamp had only become visible as a small yellow halo in the white. He had stood here in the summer thunderstorms of August, when the rain had come down in long warm sheets and the rails had hissed under it. He had stood here on the night his wife had died. 2 evenings later, when the lamps had needed to be lit and the train had needed to be met, and the work had held him then, in the way the work held a man when grief was new. He had stood here many times. He would stand here tonight for the last time. He thought the thought without grief. He let it pass. The whistle came a third time, very close now. Perhaps a mile. He could see far down the cut the first faint glow of the headlamp against the dark of the tree. The glow grew slow, the way the headlamp of a steam train grows slow in the dark of the deep woods, with the small, steady patience of an immense thing drawing near. He stepped to the edge of the platform. He could hear now the slow, steady chuff of the engine working up the grade. He could hear the small, high singing of the rails. The headlamp became slow. A small, bright yellow disc against the dark. And then a larger disc. And then a long beam of yellow reaching up the cut and casting its long, pale rectangle on the cinder ballast and the rails. He raised his lantern. He held it at the small height the railroad signal book specified. In the small, steady way he had held it 10,000 times. The flame stood up small and clean inside the chimney. The whistle came one more time. Very close. The long greeting whistle that the engineers of the branch had always used to announce themselves at Wilder's Crossing. The locomotive came around the small curve at the south end of the cut, and he could see it. It was a black 8-wheeler with a tall stack and a great brass headlamp. The number on the side of the cab in faded gold paint read 47. The cab lamp inside threw a small soft red across the wheels and the rods. The locomotive came up the rails slower. The way an engineer brings a train in at a small water stop. And the long curtain of darkness ahead of it parted around its great black shape, and the headlamp threw its long yellow beam across the platform and across Whitcomb in his small yellow circle of lantern light. and held him for a moment in the broader beam of itself, and then moved on. The locomotive came past him slow. The slow, heavy chuff of the cylinders eased. The valves let out a long, sustained sigh of white steam, which rose slow and curling into the dark above the platform. He could see the small red glow of the firebox through the open door of the cab, and the small dark figure of the fireman, a young man named Brooks, bending to his shovel. The engineer leaned from the cab window and raised a hand at him in the small, flat railroad nod. The engineer was Henry Carter. Carter had been the engineer on the evening branch run for 22 years. They had known each other in the way of an engineer and a station master on a small branch line, which is to say that they had not spent any more than 3 or 4 minutes of each working day in each other's company, but that those 3 or 4 minutes had repeated themselves perhaps 6,000 times, and the small repeated company had built into the small steady knowing of one man for another. The train came, slow to a stop. The engine eased to a halt with a long sigh of brakes, the great black bulk of it gentle in its halting. And then there was the moment in which the engine simply stood and breathed. Whitcomb walked slow down the platform toward the cab. Carter in the cab window lifted his cap. "Mr. Whitcomb." "Mr. Carter." "Cold tonight." "Cool, not bad." "Stars are good." "They are." They looked at each other for a moment. Whitcomb saw in the face of Henry Carter under the cab lamp the small, steady, weathered face of a man he had known for 22 years, with the small gray of his beard and the small lines around his eyes from many years of leaning out of cab windows into the wind. They did not speak of the closing of the line. They had spoken of it once, in the summer, when Carter had brought up the news that the date had been set. They had said all they needed to say about it. "Brooks," Carter called back into the cab. "Low. Give her the water." Brooks climbed down from the cab and went around the front of the locomotive to the water tower. He swung the spout out over the open hatch of the tender. He pulled the chain that opened the valve. The water came down with the long, full hush of a great volume of cold water entering an open hatch. Whitcomb and Carter stood, one on the platform, one in the cab, and listened. "How's William?" Carter said. Whitcomb said. "He wrote in September. He's well. He's still on the run between Helena and Missoula. Running freight now, mostly. Says he likes the freight better than the passengers. Most do. His wife's expecting again. That's three. Good for him." "Yes." They were quiet a moment. "Margaret," Carter said. "She's well. Theodore's been made the assistant principal of the school. They've moved into a house on Maple Street in Burlington. Good house. She says it has a front porch. She likes it." Carter nodded. Slow. The water at the spout hushed. The tender was filling. Whitcomb looked up the cab window at Carter. He said in his quiet way, "I appreciate the run, Carter." Carter looked back at him for a moment. He nodded. "Very small." He said, "It's been a good line." It had. Good people up here. Good freight in the old days. Good water at this tower. Yes. I'll miss it. I'll miss it too. That was all. They did not say more. They were not men for more. Brooks at the tower pulled the chain. The water cut off. The long hush of the water settling in the tender continued for another small moment and then was gone. Brooks swung the spout back over to its rest position. He chained it. He came around the front of the locomotive and climbed back up into the cab. "Full," he said, quiet. "All right," Carter said. "Mr. Whitcomb?" "Mr. Carter." Carter touched his cap. Whitcomb touched the brim of his own hat. Brooks, behind Carter in the cab, gave Whitcomb a small, flat railroad nod. Whitcomb stepped back from the cab. He walked, slow, back to the south end of the platform. He set the lantern on the planks, and he stood with his hands clasped behind him. Carter in the cab eased the throttle. The slow, heavy chuff began again. The drive wheels turned slow. The locomotive moved, very slow, forward. The tender moved. The single passenger car moved past. The small warm yellow of its windows passing slow. Before Whitcomb in the dark. Through the windows he could see in the soft yellow light. Perhaps 4 or 5 people. Scattered, mostly asleep. The conductor, a man named Latimer, whom Whitcomb had known for many years, stood in the rear of the car looking out. He raised a hand at Whitcomb as the car came past. Whitcomb raised a hand back. The single mail car behind the passenger car came past. The single small caboose came past. At the rear, the two small red marker lights on the back of the caboose burned bright against the dark of the cut. The train moved on, slow, into the dark. The chuff grew softer. Whitcomb stood on the planks at the south end of the platform and watched the train go. The two small red marker lights on the caboose grew slowly smaller. They went around the small curve at the north end of the cut. They went out of sight behind the small stand of birches at the curve. They came back into sight on the far side. Smaller now. They went around the larger curve a quarter-mile north, and they went out of sight again. This time, for good. The whistle came once more. Very far now. A long, low note from up the line. Then there was no whistle, and no chuck, and no red lights, and no train. There was only the small, dry quiet of the late October Vermont evening, with the stars above, and the small, soft hiss of his lantern at his feet, and the small, soft sigh of the cooling iron of the water tower as it gave up the last warmth of the day. He stood for a long time. He did not move. He let himself be on the platform in the way a man is in a place he's about to leave. He breathed. He looked up at the long band of the Milky Way. He looked at Venus. Lower in the west now. He looked at the dark of the cut where the marker lights had gone. He picked up the lantern. He turned slow. He walked. Slow. Back along the platform. The small, soft sound of his boots, the only sound in the valley. He came to the door. He opened it. The small, warm yellow of the 3 lamps inside came out to meet him. He stepped in. He set the lantern on the bench. He set his hands above the stove for a moment. In the small, unconscious way a man warms his hands after a stand in the cold. He walked, slow to each lamp. He stood at the first lamp, the one above the bench. He turned the small brass key on the burner. Slow. The flame shrank in the chimney. He turned the key further. The flame became a small, thin yellow tongue. He turned the key the last quarter. The flame went out. The chimney darkened. The faint smell of warm kerosene came up into the air around him. He walked to the second lamp, the one above the stove. He did the same. The flame shrank. The flame became a line. The flame went out. He walked to the third lamp, the one above the telegraph table. He stood at it for a moment. He looked at the small flame for the small, quiet space of a breath. Then he turned the key. Slow, and the flame shrank. And the flame became a line. And the flame went out. The depot was dark. He stood in the dark for a moment. His eyes adjusted. Slow. The small red glow of the firebox in the corner became, in the dark, the main light. And he could see dim the shapes of the bench and the schedule board and the telegraph table. He went to the stove. He banked it. He closed the damper. He shut the door. The red glow inside dimmed. He took his coat from the peg. He put it on. He buttoned it. He took the small lantern from the bench. He lit it again from the small box of matches in his pocket. The lantern took. He held the lantern at his side. He took the small ring of keys from his belt. He stepped to the door. He turned. He looked back. In the small light of the lantern at the small dim room of the depot, he looked for a long, quiet moment. Then he stepped out, and he pulled the door shut behind him. The door scraped gentle on the low ridge of the floorboards, as it always did. He set the key in the lock. He turned it. The lock made its small, dry click. He took the key out. He slid it back onto the ring at his belt. He stood on the platform. He looked up the line toward the north, where number 9 had gone. The cut was dark. The rails were dim silver. The water tower stood black against the stars. He turned slow. He stepped down from the platform onto the cinder path that ran out to the wagon road. He walked. The road home was a half mile west and a little north, between the long brown hayfields and the small low stand of maples along the southern fence line. He had walked it 10,000 times. He had walked it on the August evenings when the heat of the day was still in the road and the corn was high in the fields beside it. He had walked it on the January evenings when the road was a small packed track of snow, and the cold was a long, sharp thing in the lungs, and the lantern at his side was the only light in the world. He had walked it on the slow, heavy summer evenings, when Mary had been sitting on the small porch, waiting for him with a small, cold glass of cider on the small table beside her. He walked it now. The road was hard with the early frost. The small, low stars stood very bright above him. He could see his own breath, faint in the small yellow light of the lantern. The lantern light made a small moving circle of yellow on the road around his boots. And the rest of the world was the deep, clean black of late October Vermont, with the small, soft band of the Milky Way overhead, and the small, far smokes of farmhouse chimneys, faint against the stars to the north and south. He walked slow. There was no reason to hurry. There was no train tonight to flag in by midnight. There was no schedule to keep. There was only his small white house at the end of the road, and his small kettle on his small stove, and his small bed in his small bedroom. He passed the small split rail gate of the Pratchett pasture. He could see far up the rise the small yellow square of light in the upper window of Owen Pratchett's farmhouse. The light was friendly. It was the same kind of small yellow square that his own kitchen window would be. When he reached it, he thought of how a small lit window is, perhaps the small steady comfort of all human nights, the small visible sign that some other small careful soul is also awake, also banking the stove, also putting on the kettle, also drawing the chair up to the small table for the last cup of the day. He walked. He passed the small low stone wall. He passed the broken stump of the old elm. He passed the small wooden fence at the end of his property. He came at last to his own gate. The gate was a small white-painted wooden gate set into the picket fence around the dooryard. He had built the gate himself in 1884. He had built the fence the year after. The gate opened with the small, soft creak it always made. He stepped into the dooryard. He walked slow up the flagstone path to the porch. A small clump of dry chrysanthemum stalks stood beside the steps in their small wooden box. The last of the season's blooms now brown and curled. He scraped his boots. slow on the iron scraper. He set the lantern on the small bench. He took his key from the ring. He opened the door. The small, warm, dry air of the kitchen came out to meet him. He stepped in. He closed the door behind him. He hung his coat on the peg. He hung his hat above it. He took the boots off. He pulled on the soft house slippers Mary had made for him in the fall of 1898, and which he had worn every evening for 14 winters now. He moved into the kitchen. The kitchen was a small square room with a black cast iron stove against one wall, a plank table in the middle, a small dresser with a few plates and cups, a deep porcelain sink under a window, and a small kerosene lamp on the table, which he had left burning low when he had walked down to the depot earlier. The kitchen was warm. The kettle on the stove was the small black iron kettle Mary had brought from her mother's house in Bellows Falls in 1880. He set his hand on the side of the kettle. The kettle was warm. He opened the damper a small turn. He took the small tin of black tea from the shelf. He took the small white china cup from the dresser, which was Mary's cup, and which he had drunk from for the 6 years since she had died. He set the cup on the table. He sat down at the table. The chair was a plain wooden chair with a low back. It had a small dished shape worn into the seat by the long course of his sitting in it. He let his head rest back against the high wooden back. He let his eyes settle, just for a moment, on the small pale yellow of the lamp on the table. The kettle, after a small time, began to whisper, then to murmur, then to come up to its small, steady sing. He stood, slow. He took the kettle by the wooden handle. He poured the small, careful measure into the cup over the small, careful pinch of tea. He set the kettle back on the stove. He sat back down. He let the tea steep. He drank slow from the cup. The tea was good. It was the same tea he had been drinking for 30 years. He set the cup down. He sat for a long, quiet moment in the small, warm yellow of the kitchen. He did not think of much. He thought perhaps of the depot, dark now in its small clearing in the woods, with the stars above it and the cool iron of the water tower beside it. He thought of Henry Carter on the throttle of number 9, somewhere up the line. He thought of William, 3,000 miles west in Montana. He thought of Margaret in Burlington with Theodore, in the small house on Maple Street. He thought of Mary. He thought of all of them without sorrow. He held them in the small, quiet way of a man's late evening, as the small particular souls his life had been built around. He finished the cup. He set it in the sink. He banked the stove. He closed the damper. He pulled the small iron handle of the small grate, slow, and let the small last red of the coals settle in their bed. He took the small lamp from the table. He carried it through the small doorway to the small bedroom that opened off the kitchen. The bedroom was a small, low-ceilinged room with one window facing east toward the rise. An iron bedstead with a wool blanket folded twice at the foot. A small chest of drawers. A chair by the window. A washstand with a small white pitcher and basin, and a small framed photograph of Mary at 23, standing in the dooryard of the small white house in 1882, in her dark dress with the small white collar. He looked at the photograph for a small moment, as he did every evening. He set the lamp on the chest of drawers. He turned the wick low. He took off his outer clothes. He folded the trousers across the chair back, the waistcoat over them, the shirt over the chair back. He kept the union suit and the wool socks. He washed his face at the washstand. He dried it on the small cotton towel. He turned to the bed. The bed was an iron bedstead with a wool mattress on a board base. It had been in this room since the year he had moved in. The mattress had become, over 31 years, the shape of his body in long use. And it greeted him, as it always did, by remembering him. He sat on the edge of the bed. He took the small book from the bedside table. The book was a copy of the selected poems of Robert Burns in dark red cloth that he had bought in a small shop in Bellows Falls in 1875. He read in it most nights. He opened it at random and read a few lines. The lines were from a poem about a long winter evening and a small fire, and a man's own quiet thoughts at the end of a long day. The lines still came up out of the page, in the small lamplight, as quiet and large as they had ever been. He read. He did not read for long. He had read perhaps a page and a half, when his eyes began to do the slow, heavy thing they did at the end of a long evening. He marked the page with the small silk ribbon. He closed the book. He set it on the chest of drawers. He turned the lamp down to its lowest. He lay back on the bed and pulled the blanket up. The blanket was wool and heavy and smelled very faintly of the small cedar chest at the foot of the bed, where he kept it through the summer. He folded one arm behind his head. He let the other rest on his chest. He could feel under his hand the slow rise and fall of his own breath. He closed his eyes. The house in its old wooden bones settled with the small dry creak that all old houses make in the cool of a late October evening, when the day's small heat is going out of the timbers and the small night cool is coming in. The lamp on the chest of drawers burned low. He thought slow of small things. He thought of the kettle on the stove in the kitchen, banked now, waiting for the morning. He thought of the cup in the sink. He thought of the small green and cream depot at Wilder's Crossing, dark now in its small clearing in the woods. He thought of Carter, somewhere up the line. He thought of William in Montana. He thought of Margaret in Burlington. He thought of Mary and this small frame on the chest of drawers. He thought of all of them, and his thoughts slowed. They became no longer thoughts, but only the gentle drift of one thing into another. The lamps on the wall of the depot, the chalk in his hand at the schedule board, the long, low whistle of number 9 coming up the cut, the small red marker lights receding into the dark, the small soft scrape of the depot door on its low ridge, the small flat sound of his boots on the wagon road, the small yellow square of his own kitchen window seen from the gate, the warm kettle, the white china cup, the lamp on the table, the small, soft, yielding sound of the mattress, the wool of the blanket, the slow rise and fall of his own breath. He let it pass over him. He let it pass over him again. The night around the small white house went on, slow and patient, in its long, deep October quiet. And the stars overhead went on in their slow, patient turning. And far down the valley, the small bank stove of the empty depot held its last small red glow in the dark of the empty room. and Whitcomb, who was tired and warm and not afraid, drifted gently down into the deep, easy quiet of sleep. The lamp on the chest of drawers burned low. The house settled in its bones. The wool blanket held him. Whitcomb kept sleeping. The stove kept being banked. The lamps kept being out. The depot kept being dark. The rails kept being the rail. The stars kept being the star. The night kept being the night. And that was all. And now, a few quiet words to carry into sleep. You are safe. You are warm. The day is done. Nothing more is asked of you tonight. The room around you holds you gently. The bed beneath you holds you fully. Your body knows how to rest. Your mind may let go now. The long quiet is here. Sleep well, my friend. From the long quiet, sleep well, my friend. From the long quiet.